Yes. Unit 4.2 is probably, to me, on a personal level, one of the most important things that we cover
Are you
in the
sharing?
entirety of the class. Oh, I'm not sharing. I should be, right? We cover a lot of important material, and I think and hope it comes through that I am very adamant about representing the best interest of my clients and taking care of my clients and doing things the right way. I think and hope that comes through. But what I think is even more important than protecting the best interest of clients is improving our industry, improving the legacy of our industry. The truth is that the housing industry in this country has serious issues when it comes to providing the equal level of services to all people, irrespective of things like their race, their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, their cultural backgrounds. All kinds of things have really factored into for a very long time in this country. What options there were for people to consider as far as housing goes, and we see the continued effects of that even today. Where I grew up in eastern North Carolina, I grew up outside of Tarboro, and there was and still is very much one side of town for one ethnicity and another side of town for other ethnicities. And it is nearly as segregated today in 2022 as it was in 1982 and probably in 1952. So it is really, really important, in my opinion, that we address the ongoing issues that are created when we don't treat people equally in their search for real estate. Because ultimately, real estate is the most important purchase that people will make. It is what roots us. It is, and when you don't provide people with access to the full sort of menu of what's available to them, you really are limiting their lives in a very real way. And so it's important to me that you all not only get this for test taking purposes, but get it from the standpoint of why these laws exist, and not just what the law says, but what the intent of the law is. Now, that being said, we certainly have to get you past the test. So I'm always going to veer back toward getting you past the test. But I
Well,
do I do ask for your assistance and your patience in one regard here before we go into this section. I find that the most effective way to teach this topic is to give real world sort of statements and examples that one might encounter.
mm-hmm.
I want you to understand that if I make a real world statement, I'm using it as an example of what somebody might encounter. It's not something I necessarily would say or think or do or whatever, but we learn from a real example in a lot of cases. And so
Right.
it's very hard for me. Somebody one time said, well, I just don't think you should talk about people's religion. And my response was, well, I find it very hard to talk about not discriminating against religion if we can't talk about religion. So can we all agree that we have to have the grace for each other when we talk about this topic to be able to talk about this topic and recognize that we're doing so to get better? Is that fair for everybody? Right?
Absolutely. When we talk about this section, this is why this is my favorite section, because I mean, honestly, discrimination on multiple levels have gotten to a point where it's just uncomfortable to even talk about it in today's day and age, because it shouldn't be talked about. But I think this section, the way it's presented, yes, we are going to have to talk about some very uncomfortable statements. But what's going to happen is we're going to learn that there is value in exposing this to the public, because generational wealth is built through real estate, and there's some groups of people who have been excluded from that. And the only way to reverse that cycle is exposing it. And I'm trying to find
Well,
this
and
video that we watched in post-licensing over the summer, so I'll let you know if I have it.
Okay, good. And it has to. We have to do better, and that's why this is a section that is so near and dear to me. I think a lot of what ends up getting us in the wrong direction in that regard is unintentional, and that is why it's tougher to fix. So, now that we've kind of gotten the disclaimers out of the way, let's talk about how you're going to be presented with this on the test, and then let's talk about some of the things that you're going to have to deal with in the real world. I actually think of all the topics on the test, they probably do the best job of testing real world scenarios, not just making up fake scenarios when it comes to the discriminatory type situations. So I really think that this is one of those sections where we can have some kind of real world approach to things, because they're not trying to invent awkward, never before seen like agency scenarios like they do in the agency sections. The first law that we deal with as real estate brokers relating to non-discrimination practices is actually a law that has been the law in the United States since 1866. If you are a student of history at all, you will recognize that 1866 was immediately following the end of the Civil War. So obviously this is a product of the Civil War. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, and it is still the law in the United States of America. Now, I have to point this out before I talk about this law. Don't take for granted, folks, that people will follow the law. We've said that before in this class, right? Just because something is the law doesn't mean the law has been followed at all times, does it?
Right.
Our challenge is always to make sure that people continue to get better about following the law. I want you to think about how almost sadly laughable it is that it has been illegal in the United States of America since 1866 to discriminate against anyone in any situation on the basis of race. That was illegal in the United States beginning in 1866. Folks, did race-based discrimination stop in 1866 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act?
No, it did not.
No, not even close. I mean, the entire Jim Crow era was 100 years after that. And that was an example not just of the public participating in racism, but the government participating in racism itself. And, the whole idea of separate but equal and those kinds of things. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that though this has been the law for a very long time, we still have challenges in following the law. Now, this law is very targeted. Here's what I mean. Mm-hmm. This is not a blanket non-discrimination law. You're going to have to be very careful about that, because it is very tempting on a test to answer with your heart rather than your head when it comes to non-discrimination laws. What does it say is the protected sort of topic by the Civil Rights Act of 1866? You cannot discriminate on the basis of what? Race. Would it be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to refuse to rent a home to someone because they are too old?
No.
Good answer.
No. Would it be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to refuse to sell a home to someone because they are Catholic? No. You need to get comfortable with saying no as that answer. I realize that may feel wrong, and you might go, that's wrong. But you're not being tested on what's wrong in a moral or ethical sense, because number one, everybody's going to have a different definition of that. Number two, that's not what we're tested on. We're tested on the what? The law. And so before you answer, because you will get a test question where you'll be expected to answer to this law, before you say something is a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, make sure that any discrimination that is occurring in that example is related specifically to the topic of what?
Race.
Only race is protected in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Someone sent me a private question that says, does this law extend beyond real estate? It does. This is a law that is not limited to real estate. This is not a real estate specific law. This law makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in hiring, in employment situations, in food service situations, and hotels, and it is a society-wide law. But obviously, that does apply to us. Yes.
I was going to say, remember how we just went over a question before we went on our last break? We had said, which is a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. They were all wrong, but only one was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Exactly.
Same thing of what Travis just said about this.
Seth just made a great point for you for test taking, folks. You're going to get questions that say, which of the following would represent a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and all four of them might be violations of some law. But before you say it's a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, what do you have to make sure is the activity that you're identifying?
Race.
Discrimination based on race. Are we all clear on that?
So maybe remind yourself that R in rights in civil rights stands for race.
So it's when you look at this law, I've had people say, that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act. They will not sell me that house because I am Baptist. That is not a violation of the Civil Rights Act, folks. It's not. It's not nice. It's not acceptable to me on a personal level, but it's also not a violation of this law. Does that make sense for everyone? Ben? Yes. It has to be specific to race for it to be considered a violation of this law. Now, the thing to understand about this law, once you understand it is limited to race, please also understand it is not limited in any other way. This is the only law we deal with in this class that deals with any real estate transaction. This is for commercial transactions. This is for residential transactions. This is for land-based transactions. This is for rentals. This is for sales. This applies to everything, but only protects against discrimination based on race. Are we all good with that? Because that's going to be all we say about the Civil Rights Act.
Yes.
Okay. Good? Yeah? All right. Good. Now, the next law, which is going to be much more a point of focus for us, and it's actually probably the one that you've heard much more about over your lifetime when it comes to real estate, is something called the Federal Fair Housing Act. How many of you just kind of like thumbs up or show of hands? How many of you ever heard of the Fair Housing Act? Okay. The Fair Housing Act is the federal law that is specifically targeted to real estate transactions. But again, not all real estate transactions. Look at the name of it. Sometimes you have to stop and think about the name. Remember we talked about the North Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Act. It only applies to what kind of property? Residential. Look at the name of this law. The Fair what? Housing Act. Is it a violation of the Fair Housing Act to refuse to sell or rent something to somebody that's a commercial property?
No.
No. Because the Fair Housing Act only applies when the real estate in question is what? Residential. Some type of housing. Yeah. Everybody good?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the first. The name gives you a big indication of what type of property, what type of real estate we're focused on. It doesn't apply to vacant land transactions. It doesn't apply to commercial settings. It just only applies if the property itself contains a residential structure.
Take that in, because you will also get a question that gives you something along the lines of commercial, and you'll want to answer from your heart. Don't answer from your heart.
Well, that's exactly right. They'll give you an example of a violation of the principle of the Fair Housing Act, but they'll say it's a shopping center. Well, even if it violates the principle of the Fair Housing Act, if it's a shopping center, it's not a violation of the law because the law doesn't apply in that situation.
But the Civil Rights Act
would. The Civil Rights Act would, but the Civil Rights Act is also limited to only protecting for discrimination based on what? Race. So I've had people at this point ask, well, why do we need two laws? If the Civil Rights Act covers all types of real estate, why do we also need the Fair Housing Act? And if you haven't already figured it out, I'm going to tell you why. Because the Civil Rights Act only prevents discrimination on the basis of race. Does the Civil Rights Act provide relief for people who are discriminated based on their religion?
No.
No. Does the Civil Rights Act provide relief for people who are discriminated based on whether or not they have children?
No.
No. Does the Civil Rights Act provide relief based on somebody's language that they speak or the country they were born in? No. And so the reason we need two separate laws is, quite honestly, the Civil Rights Act leaves a lot of gaps. And so the Fair Housing Act was meant to come along and close some of those gaps. But for reasons that are not known to me, because I was not around in 1968 when this law was passed, they decided to limit it only to residential real estate. I'm just going to throw this out there for you all, folks. I would find it grotesque if some commercial developer said, I'm not going to sell you this property because you're Muslim, and I think that's grotesque. I would be appalled, personally. But would that be a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yes.
No, hold on, think about it.
No,
If
because
some commercial developer says, I'm not selling you this shopping center because you're Muslim, and I find that grotesque.
It's commercial.
No.
Commercial.
It's commercial. I would find that to be awful. I would want to punch somebody right in the face.
From your heart,
But you have
it's
to,
wrong.
because from the heart, you're going to give the wrong answer. You can't answer discrimination questions based on your heart. You have to think about what law would be in effect. And the only law that would be in effect, potentially, would be the Fair Housing Act. And a shopping center doesn't fall under the what?
Criteria.
It doesn't meet the criteria. It's not residential. Are you starting to see why it's so important to really focus in on, does the law apply in this particular situation?
Yes.
Because otherwise you're going to miss these questions on the test big time. Okay. So the Fair Housing Act applies to residential situations only. It applies only to residential real estate licensees, so us, and residential real estate landlords. Now, I want to point something out to you all here. Okay. Does this law apply to residential sellers?
No.
No.
Answer.
Does this law apply to residential buyers?
No.
No.
Does this law apply to tenants? No. How many of you would have missed that question right away? If somebody asked you out on the street, do sellers have to follow the Fair Housing Act? How many of you have been like, hell yeah, they got to follow it?
So I thought about it. Yeah.
They don't. They don't. What are the groups of people that have to follow this law?
Landlord. Residential real estate.
licenses.
Brokers and
Brokers
And landlord,
and landlords
residential.
in residential properties. That's it, folks. Brokers and landlords dealing with what?
Residential.
Residential property. That's it. That's all. Everybody else skates on this law. Is it legal for a seller to refuse to sell their house to somebody because of their religion?
Yes.
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 Is it?
No.
Yes.
No, it's not.
Yes. It doesn't apply, Alexa, to who? Sellers.
Sellers.
Not seller's agent.
It simply does not apply to sellers. It might apply to their agent, but it doesn't apply to the seller themselves. There is nothing illegal about that seller refusing to do that. As much as that just drives us nuts, it's the way the law is written.
Right.
And that's the way it's going to be tested. Janet, you had a question?
Where is this slide? I don't see it.
I don't have it either.
Yeah, I don't have it either.
Hold on,
Me
before
either,
everybody
yeah.
starts saying that Travis updates his slides.
This is a
This
good
one's
one.
not super important. I'm putting it in your recap notes.
Is this not in Learn Test Pass?
I do not think so.
No, it's not. No.
Oh.
I see it, Everett, on mine. I see the slide.
And
We see it on.
printed and I don't,
It's not on the
Print
slide.
it, just
Print it.
on our
I
break.
just checked the link that he sent. Oh, yeah.
Well, we'll get it to you.
Okay.
Don't stress.
I don't know.
See it in
I don't know why
Learn
I don't know why it didn't get updated in there. I'll get it updated in Learn Test Pass, but it just take a screen picture of it. Snap a
let me
picture of
grab
it.
that.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Good.
Okay, so this law does not apply to, I know it's a good one, that's why I added it. It does not apply to sellers, it does not apply to buyers, and it does not apply to tenants. Only to brokers or licensees, and only to landlords, and only then in residential settings. So it's very limited, right?
Yes.
You have to be really careful before you say something is a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So this has been the law since 1968. It's been changed a couple times in 1974, 1988. You don't need to know those years. I would say you need to be comfortable with the fact that it's the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that it became law. So when we say this law provides protection, we need to talk about what protection really means, because that's another way you are going to go off the rails with these questions. I want you to write something down on this slide. What does it mean to be protected? Singled out. The law says there are certain things about people that we cannot single out, that we cannot focus on. Why do I say singled out? Because we could focus on things in a negative way, or we could also focus on them in a what?
Positive way.
Positive.
A positive way.
Like you want to be inclusive of a certain group.
That is just as illegal as being exclusive of a certain group. So I'll give you an example of something that would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Refusing to rent to a family based on the fact that they immigrated from China. That would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Everybody okay with that statement?
Yes.
Okay. We're refusing to rent this home to this family because they're from China. If a broker refused to do that or a landlord refused to do that, that would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Everybody with me on that?
Yes.
And it's easy to say that's a violation because it's, oh, that's gross. That's a violation. What about a broker who has a flyer that says, we specialize in helping Chinese families relocate to Raleigh?
Uh-huh.
No. Nope.
Yeah.
Very bad.
No.
Is that a violation?
You see what I'm
Yes, that sounds
Yep.
terrible.
Yes.
It's exactly the same thing, folks.
And if you think about it, I get why it's terrible, but if you think about it, you would also think like, oh my gosh, that's giving them an avenue to have somebody to
It's so
trust.
nice. Folks, it still violates the law. When we say it's protected, we mean it cannot be singled out. So in other words, if their ethnicity is the thing that's being protected, that means we can't single out their ethnicity in any direction. The fact that they, in a good way or a what?
Bad way.
Or a bad way. Everybody with me on that?
I have a question. Does it also maybe affect like maybe your occupation? So like I'm in a military town and some people think, oh, well, you're a military family, sweet, or oh no.
We're gonna talk about if what things are protected. We haven't gotten to the list of things that are protected, Jessica. We will. Trust me, that's coming. I'm holding that back for just a second. Because before I put that list up, I want you to understand that when we say it's protected, that means you can't talk about it, period. Good, bad, or indifferent. Watch. This one's easy. Would it be a violation to refuse to sell a house to someone because they are Christian?
Yes.
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 Religion.
Because you're discriminating based on their religion, correct?
Yes.
Would it be a violation to put scripture on your business card and say you specialize in helping members of the Christian faith find a home?
Yeah.
I guess
Yes.
so, yeah.
It's the same violation, folks. One might feel good, but in the eyes of the law, it's the same violation. Because in both cases, you have singled out people based on something that the law says you can't single them out based on. Does that make everybody good with that?
Yes.
Okay. And so you got to make sure you understand the relevance here. Okay. Jessica said So all the ads that say, we'll help you if you have an ITIN, which would be something that somebody would only have if they were not born in the United States, correct? That is very much a fair housing violation, folks. Even though it's meant in a positive manner, that's a fair housing violation, okay? Because you're singling them out based on their ethnicity, based on their nationality. So it's really, ITN is a number that's issued when somebody comes to the country other than through birth, like a taxpayer identification number, for example. So non-citizens. Citizens have social security numbers. Non-citizens generally have TINs. Okay. Timothy, this is not a felony. No, this is not a felony level offense. This would be a misdemeanor level offense. But more importantly, you can be fined for this by fair housing boards if you violate it. So when we say that equal terms have to be offered, what we mean is don't single people out based on the things that we say are protected. Now, that does not mean that everything is going to be protected, because everything is not going to be protected. There are going to be things that we talk about and you're like, oh, that makes sense. But then there are going to be some that you're like, and it might not hit you that they're not on the list until I throw the question at you. Here's what I would challenge you. Don't answer quickly. When I ask you if something is a violation, I want you to think about it and I want you to go back and look at the list. Fair enough? Before you answer, I want you to think, and I want you to go back and look at the list. And if you can't find it on the list, it's not a violation of the law. But also, don't let your goodwill get in the way of you. I'll give you an example. Would it be a violation to refuse to show apartments on the third floor to someone who's in a wheelchair? Do you think that would be a violation? If you told them, I can't show you apartments on the third floor because you're in a wheelchair and you'd never be able to get up there. You'd never be able to get up there.
Yes.
Pretty easy to say that one's a violation, correct?
Correct.
Oh, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Thomas. Listen, I went ahead and scheduled the showings for you. I noticed we had a couple of third floor units that were available, but I took those off the list because obviously that's not going to work for you with you being in a wheelchair.
Why'd you do that?
Yes.
Is that a violation as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Completely well-meaning, but that's not for me to say.
Yep.
That's for them to decide. Does everybody see that?
Right. Good or bad.
I'm singling him out based on that disability. I'm providing a different, or is it starting to formulate in your brain now? Wait a minute, giving equal terms is harder than it seemed like, right? Because we naturally want to help. You can't do that when it's on this list. You have to let them make their own decisions. So are we ready for the list? Are we ready for the things that from this point forward, when you are a residential real estate broker, you will no longer ever discuss ever again? Are we ready for those things?
Yes.
As a residential real estate broker, you will never discuss corn again. It's off limits. No, fresh corn is just a little, it's like old car. It's a little bit of a mnemonic tool to help you remember the protected classes. There are 7 of them. And if you write out fresh corn, all of the letters stand for the 7 protected classes. The E and the O just stand for equal opportunity, which are not protected classes, but all the consonants will help you remember the 7 protected classes. Now, some of these are very self-explanatory.
Right.
Some of them are not. We're going to talk in detail about the ones that are not. Let's start with the ones that are self-explanatory.
And I just want to call out the fact that you guys are naturally going to have questions that are going to be like, well, how do I respond? We'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
Just hold on to it.
So,
and Tracy asked a good question. I answered already, but I would rather you take it. She said, what if you put hablamos español?
stop right there. Tracy said, what if you put hablamos español? That seems to me to target everyone equally, because you're simply saying This is a skill that I possess. I possess the skill to speak Spanish, correct?
Correct.
But I have a major issue with the second part of what Tracy put in that message in the chat. She said, how about if I put Hablamos Espanol on my business card, but then I only hand those cards out to people that are Spanish speakers? Bang!
That's what made me think about it. I was like,
you singled them out because of, and look at the list, their national origin.
right.
You looked at them, you said, you're not from here, so let me give you the card that tells you I speak Spanish. Isn't that singling them out?
Yes. And also, I had to remind this to, go ahead, Tracy.
Sorry, no, I meant that would be only directing to Spanish speakers if I was to say that on my advertisement. I didn't mean to give it to only Spanish speakers.
Well, no, here's the thing. You're not, you might think whatever you think, but you're not directing it only to Spanish speakers when you say hablamos español. I speak un poquito de español, and I'm very impressed when I see people that speak Spanish in our industry, and you're not targeting me. You know, I see that on somebody's business card, and I'm like, good for them, because that's a really underserved community. We need more people that speak Spanish. So while I understand the thought process behind it, you are simply advertising a skill set. That is no different than somebody putting on their business card that they are an expert contract negotiator. That is a skill set that somebody might want in an agent. Somebody might want an agent that speaks Spanish. Maybe they're moving to Ecuador and they just want to hear they want to hear the language before they move. You see what I'm saying? It's just a skill. And so I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with it, though, if you put it there and you only hand that out when you go to Hispanic communities, or you put those cards in the Hispanic grocery store and you have different business cards that you hand out when you go to Cheesecake Factory. That's a problem.
It would be a big difference if you said we are experts in helping Spanish.
And that's different because, again, you're calling them out, right?
Right.
Putting Se Hablamos Español on your business card simply says this is a skill set. But if you put right under that, we specialize in helping the Spanish-speaking community, now you're singling them out.
Right. Also, real quick before we start going through this, I had to remind our night class last night that if Travis is ever correcting somebody, consider you all being corrected. So that does not give anybody.
Right. No, I'm not. It's not putting somebody on blast. I just using your name helps you retain.
But
that's why I do.
It's a huge pet peeve of mine for other people to speak up and start putting that person down or correcting them. You don't have the authority to do that.
Right. Not that anybody's done that. Not that anybody's done that here. We just
no. We are all a team. We are corrected as a team, and we move forward as a team. That's
exactly. Now, I'm not going to talk about familial status right now because that one's going to open a lot of questions. It's confusing the name. But is race pretty self-explanatory as a protected class?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. Refusing to sell to someone because they are black, would that be discrimination under the Federal Fair Housing Act?
Yes.
Yes.
Having a first-time homebuyer program specifically targeted people who are black, would that be discrimination under the Federal Fair Housing Act?
Yes.
You notice how one is a feel-good thing, but it's still just as much of a violation of the law.
Yes.
That's what you have to grasp about this thing. You can't single out people based on race. If it's on this list, it goes out the window as a topic, right? So could you answer this question as a broker? Are there a lot of people in this neighborhood who are black? Could you answer that question?
No.
How about if they said, well, I'm really looking for more of a diverse neighborhood. Are there black families in the neighborhood? They may be asking it in a positive way. Can you answer that question?
No.
Oh, wow.
No, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. How many of you feel like that's like a revelatory moment? Like, oh, I would have never thought that was bad. Right?
Because people do it all the time.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, true.
Exactly.
And then also, if a client comes up or even a customer and they're saying, we really want to be in a community with just Mexican or Spanish people because we want to feel more included.
I will tell you, I actually have a harder time in my career over the last few years, and I'm glad it's this way versus the other way. I actually have a much harder time with people who want diversity and trying to navigate this than ones who want to be exclusionary. Because I very often do have clients who will say things like, well, you know, what's the diversity like in this neighborhood? I don't want to be in an all-white neighborhood. I would prefer to be in a neighborhood that has, you know, families from all different backgrounds because I want my kids to experience that. And I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Even though they mean it in a completely positive way, I can't go there. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right.
Because it's the whole topic that is off limits.
Yes, it should be mixed anyways, so we shouldn't have to, unfortunately, diversify that.
So,
Erica said, could the E stand for ethnicity because national origin doesn't necessarily cover that?
well, I mean, whatever's gonna help you remember is fine. I mean, this fresh corn is just kind of like a suggested tool. You know, obviously they're not going to test you on fresh corn. They're going to test you on these classes. You know, so if as long as you can remember, if you think ethnicity is going to be something you recognize in a test question, then that by all means, that's fine. You know, just make sure you understand that you got to be able to recognize these in situational questions. So that's what you got to work out for yourself. So race is pretty self-explanatory. Sex, relatively self-explanatory. Now, I do want to say, notice I said relatively self-explanatory. I do want to point out to you folks, I know that societally right now there is, you know, a relatively large debate and divide among people about the trans community and gender choice and those kinds of things. And I'm not opposed to that conversation, but I'm not trying to open that conversation because it's really beyond our scope in this class. What I'm just pointing out to you is that it's not that someone is a member of the trans community that's a protected class. If you're talking about that, you are by necessity talking about their what?
Their sex.
Their sex, their gender. And the whole idea of gender or sex is a protected class. So it really doesn't matter if they are biologically male, biologically female, if they identify as a male, if they identify as a female, what their preferred pronouns are. None of that matters because it all relates back to the topic that for us in a residential transaction is completely what?
Off
limits.
And so for me, that's much easier for us in that regard, right? We kind of avoid that, you know, current, you know, issue, no matter where somebody falls on that, because we would simply say, well, you know what? We don't focus on gender. It's just not a topic we focus on, and we're not allowed to focus on it, which is very true for residential brokers. Okay. Handicapping status or disability. So handicapping status or, I don't know why I did that, or disability. Again, don't focus on it in a negative way, but also don't focus on it in a what?
Good way.
In a positive way. You know, so I saw one a couple weeks ago, and I actually stopped the car and I went in to the office in an apartment complex and I told them, you need to take that down. Because when I saw it, I immediately realized it was well intended, but I immediately recognized it was a fair housing violation. I drove by an apartment complex, it's a new development, and they had a sign out front, and it said, service animals gladly welcomed. Now, how many of you think that is meant in a positive way, to say we are inclusive of service animals? What do y'all think?
Yes.
But it doesn't matter.
But it's still singling people out based on the fact, because if they have a service animal, they have a what? Disability. Do you recognize how that's a fair housing violation now?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I went in and I
it's kind of
said,
stupid to put that because it's a given.
well, and that's what I told him. I said, that's a given. You don't have a choice about that. So you don't need to advertise it, number one. It's the law. You have to accept them. And number two, you can't, that's no different than putting a sign out front that says, it's perfect for you if you're in a wheelchair. And we would never do that, right? You know, but in the eyes of the law, that's the same violation.
Okay.
Okay?
What part of it is off limits are we not getting?
right? And so we just, nothing that targets people based on disability in
Again,
a good or bad way. In a good or bad way.
Positive manner cannot talk about it. So can you advertise a home with a handicapper's ramp?
You
What do
can't
you think
advertise
the answer is?
handicap anything about a property because you're targeting people who have what?
Disability.
Handicaps. Whether you're, and I get it. So I told you it was going to be tough. I told you it was going to be tough because you want to help. And I love High's comment. Fresh corn, these are topics that are off limits. Don't bring them up in a positive or negative way. Stay away from them. And not only do you not bring them up, you stay away from them if somebody else tries to bring them up. You get away from it. You let them know that you can't. Okay? Again, here's the thing, John. You're making this so much harder on yourself. Don't make this so much harder on yourself. First of all, is an Airbnb a residential property?
Yes.
So then if you are either a real estate broker or a landlord of an Airbnb, you do not say anything about the word handicap or disability, period. You don't do it.
What about a tiny house? No. What about a, no.
You know?
That's how you have to think of it.
I mean, you just can't do it. Madison, yes, hotels are absolutely designated as commercial property. Absolutely. Are you thinking just because somebody sleeps there, it might be residential? Residential means you own it as a home. Yeah, hotel is absolutely commercial property. So can a hotel say handicap accessible?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Because it's commercial. It's only applies to
Because this law doesn't apply. Right. This law does not apply. Somebody sent me a question, said, if someone is handicapped, can you ask them if a third floor property is okay? I have a problem with that question. I have a problem with the lead in to that question. If someone is handicapped, can you ask them if a third floor property is okay? My answer would be no to that question. Mm-hmm. Because the follow-up would be Seth's follow-up in the chat. That's only an okay question if you ask what?
To everyone.
Everybody. Treat them the same. Do not single them out. You're essentially saying to them, I've noticed you're in a wheelchair, so I thought maybe the third floor wouldn't work for you. That's not how you would treat anybody else.
No.
Let me ask y'all this. I'm going to just break it down for you. I'm fat. Would you say to me, well, I'm only going to show you first floor properties because you're too fat to walk your fat ass up to the third floor anyway, so I thought that wouldn't be a good fit for you. Would you do that?
No.
Or would you stay away from it because you would be worried I would find that offensive, that you would decide for me? Now, here's the truth. I would have already decided in my mind, I ain't walking my fat ass up to the third floor. You better show me a first floor apartment. But that's for me. How many of you think that's for me to decide, not you to decide for me? Right?
Yes, you decide.
Of course. Yeah.
If I say to someone who has a disability, are you okay with a third floor? Immediately, they're going to internalize that and think, are you only asking that because of my disability? And they should feel that way. It's not for us to do, folks. This is not difficult if you just get away from all your own hang-ups.
How to get around it. There's no getting around it.
Right.
And I know I've heard you say this in classes before, Travis. What if that person's not looking at the property for themselves? What if they're buying it for their son, daughter, brother, sister?
You have no idea who they're buying it for. So why should you make those presuppositions? Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Let them tell you what
and
they
we
want
don't know.
Property.
I don't know that their condition's permanent. Could somebody be shopping while they're in a wheelchair just because they had foot surgery? And then maybe they're a marathon runner for all I know. Right? That's not for me to decide. Danielle?
And I get it that people are going to naturally wonder when the questions come up, how do we respond? We'll get there. Focus on getting what's off limits first.
And by the way, somebody else just sent me a private question. Are you required to disclose a property being handicap accessible? I love you, but there's no such fucking thing as handicap accessible when it comes to residential property, folks. That doesn't exist.
I need blood pressure medicine.
The whole topic is off limits. That doesn't exist. Get away from it. Let them decide if it works for them.
Alexia, I'm ignoring the question. We are going to focus on what's protected.
Right.
Then we'll
And
talk about how to respond.
But I love that line of thinking. You just always ask, what do you want? Isn't that the best way to avoid all this? Tell me what you want. Right?
That's the concept first.
Vicky, you had your hand up before we move on. I think you had a question.
Yeah, but I think now that I'm kind of like understanding more, it might be like a quote unquote stupid question. But what about like senior citizen living? Does that kind of count in a way?
Again, Vicky, there's no kind of guessing here. We're looking at the list. What did I say? Before you ask yourself is a violation, look at the list. So Vicky wants to know if senior citizens and I'm assuming age and all that, is that something we can discuss, folks? Is that on the list?
No.
No.
Do you see age on here?
No.
Is it a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act to say to somebody, you are too damn old to buy a house in here and you know it? Get out of my face.
No, you can say it.
No.
No, it is not. It is absolutely
and this is why we're
not.
saying grasp the protected classes first, because not everybody's getting this yet. So with the questions, what do we do if they ask? Hold on.
If you said yes, you're answering from here, not from here. Because to answer from the head, you have to look at the what?
The list.
The list. You got to look at that list. And if age ain't on that list, I have not violated this law, folks.
You old as hell. I ain't showing you this property.
Might be gross, but it's legal.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So, handicap, disability, pretty obvious. Color, I think that's less obvious, but basically, color is skin pigment versus race is more based on your lineage, based on your ethnicity, essentially your DNA makeup would be more race based. Color is more like skin pigment. I mean, somebody can have the same race but have entirely different skin pigments. But obviously, in this country, we're very shallow and we have kind of lumped all that together. But, I think still same general idea applies. Religion, again, in neither a negative way or a positive way. And by the way, the lack of religious belief is still religious belief in the sense of don't say things like, well, I'm not comfortable representing an atheist. That's still discriminating based on their what?
Religion.
Their religious belief.
The presence or absence.
The presence or absence of religious beliefs, Listen, there's some interesting beliefs out there, and none of them are my business when it comes to a residential real estate transaction. If that's their religious belief, I'm going to stay away from it, positively or negatively. Let me ask y'all a question. Based on that, beautiful 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house in Prestonwood located directly across from St. James Cathedral. Is that a good description to use for the property?
No.
You see the cathedral.
No, because who are you targeting? Whether you want to or not, or realize it or not, who are you targeting?
Those type of
Religious group.
People who are probably Catholic who might go to St. James Cathedral, correct? And who are you excluding, whether you meant to or not? People who don't like Catholics and people who don't want to be around those of a religious. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
That's not a good way to describe things.
Talk about the property, not the people.
There you go. Okay. So be careful with that. And we talked about national origin, which means like place of birth. Language spoken generally does fall under the national origin type thing. So look at this question. It says Sam Seller refuses to sell his home to a buyer because they were born in Ecuador. Which of the following federal laws would be violated by this? A, the Federal Fair Housing Act. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. C, both the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act. D, neither the Fair Housing Act nor the Civil Rights Act. So Sam Seller refuses to sell his home to a buyer because they were born in Ecuador. Which of the following federal laws would be violated? Do not answer until you have looked at the list and looked at the laws.
I'm turning the chat off for a second because we're not following directions.
You got to take a moment to stop yourself, censor yourself, look at the chat. Go through them. Which of the following federal laws will be violated? The Federal Fair Housing Act. Yes or no? Would the Federal Fair Housing Act be violated here, folks?
Yes.
Yes.
Only for race.
The fair house, yes.
Only for
No.
brokers or licensed.
He's a seller.
But he's a seller.
He's a seller.
He's a seller.
Right.
Not applied to
The
him.
Federal Fair Housing Act does not apply to who?
Seller.
Sellers.
I don't like that we said, but he's a seller.
And broker.
It's not yes, but he's a seller. It's a no.
It just doesn't apply to him as the seller.
Okay, so if this instead of a SAM seller, it will be like broker. It will be under.
Correct, Shinar. You know what a good expression I had from my grandfather what that is, though?
Mm-hmm.
If a bullfrog had wings, he would not bump his ass hopping all day long. Don't do that to yourself. Don't go. Because here's what you're trying to do. You're excusing the fact that you were wrong. Oh, but if it had been this, well, guess what? It won't.
It's not.
And I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm saying that you have to realize what you're doing there. What you're doing is trying to soften the blow of being wrong. You just need to tell yourself you're just wrong. You ignored the rule. And the rule is apply the law as written. And Sam Seller is not subject to the Federal Fair Housing Act. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
And I appreciate you sharing it, Shinar.
I do too. And
Yeah.
the only reason you should be agreeing is because you're agreeing for yourself.
Right. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Would this be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866?
No.
No.
No. Is Sam Seller subject to the Civil Rights Act of 1866?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
no.
Sam Seller is subject to the Civil Rights Act of
Based on
1866.
any circumstance.
Transaction.
Because there is no limitation to who has to follow the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
The Civil Rights Act only applies to discrimination based on what?
On race.
Race.
So this one goes away because the Civil Rights Act does not cover discrimination based on where somebody was born, correct?
Right. Correct.
Yes.
Well, then clearly it ain't C. So what does that leave us with?
D.
D. Folks, you cannot jump at these questions.
Yes.
People do not do poorly on this part of the exam because this is hard. People do poorly on this part of the exam because they are hard-headed and they do not stop and slow down and actually apply the law.
Right. You got to put it into perspective.
Yeah. Anthony.
Okay, I have a question. I was confused. I knew A wasn't the right answer, but I was confused on B because you said the Civil Rights Act of 1866, isn't it? If they refuse it, refuse because he was born in Ecuador, and since he is from Ecuador, and it's like it is a race. I guess
That is not a race. I was born in Ecuador, Anthony. What race am I?
Oh, true.
Ah, got him. Got him.
National origin. Okay.
Where you're born is your nation of origin, not your race. I hate to tell you, your race does not change because you were born in a different place.
True. Okay, I was just confused on that definition.
There you go. That's why we do this. I love that you brought it up.
I get
Does
that
it-
confused as well.
But does everybody see the difference? Christina, do you see the difference? You know, see what you're doing is making the assumption that somebody born in Ecuador is a certain race. Being born in Ecuador just means your body was physically in Ecuador when you came out of the womb. That doesn't dictate your race. Your race is not dictated by where you are born.
Well, just like there's a lot of races that are born in the United States just because they're born in the United
That's
States.
right. I mean,
They're raised.
I mean, you know, just because at this point we would all be one race. We were all born here, or most of us, the vast majority of us, right? There's a place of birth does not dictate our race. So that's why we do this. You got to understand the differentiation. Don't make connections that are not there because you'll miss the questions if you do. Look at this one. Susie Seller refuses to sell her farm to a buyer because they are white/Caucasian. Which of the following federal laws would be violated? All right, stop and think before you answer. A, the Federal Fair Housing Act. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. C, both the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act. D, neither the Fair Housing Act nor the Civil Rights Act. Which one would be violated?
D, none of them.
No, it's civil
B.
rights. It's
B,
race.
because it's
Talking
race.
about race.
It's race.
No, she's selling a farm. That's not a residence.
Okay, let's talk about it. Susie Seller. First of all, what law goes away as soon as we recognize we're talking about the seller? What law goes away? What one can we eliminate right away?
Fair housing.
Fair
Housing goes away. Does everybody agree that fair housing goes away as soon as
Then
we,
C can go away.
as soon as we talk about Susie Seller? Because Susie Seller does not have to follow fair housing. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Right.
Make it easy on ourselves.
Okay. Susie Seller does have to follow the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So that one is still in play. Everybody with me on that?
You can remember that it applies to a seller because she's a civilian, Civil Rights Act.
Okay. Now, what is the one thing that the Civil Rights Act says that Susie Seller cannot focus on about that buyer?
Race.
Their race.
Race. Has she focused on the one thing that she's not allowed to focus on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Is that a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866?
Yes.
Yes. So that means D goes away. What's our answer?
B.
B.
And it says any real estate transaction. It doesn't just say that it's residential.
Correct. Remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is not limited to residential transactions. It's all transactions, all parties without limitation, right?
Good job.
The only one that's limited to just brokers and just landlords is the Civil Rights, is the Fair Housing Act.
Housing.
The Civil Rights Act is not limited in that way. Okay? So make sure you are applying these laws in the correct situations. How many of you feel like that's going to be more of a challenge than I thought it was going to be? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it does help out though.
It does.
Yep.
It does. You really got to go through it and pick it apart, right? There's no reason to miss these questions, but you've got to pick them apart to do it. Okay. Erica, so which one is land and commercial not covered? Look at the name of them, Erica. Which one sounds like it would not apply to land and commercial? The Federal Fair Housing Act. There you go. The one that
That's
has
what
the
you have to do on your test.
right. The one that you do have to do that. The Fair Housing Act. The name tells you what kind of real estate it applies to. It applies to
Use what's in front
housing.
of you.
Applies to housing. And the good news is the one that's limited to housing is also the one that's limited to only certain people, right? The one that's limited to housing is the one that's limited to just brokers and just landlords. The Civil Rights Act, which is not limited to just housing, is also not limited. Does the Civil Rights Act apply to everybody?
Yep.
Yes. Does the Civil Rights Act apply to all real estate?
Yes.
Yes.
Right? So it's unlimited. It's just only targeted at one class. Whereas the Fair Housing Act is much more limited, but targeted at 7 classes versus 1. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay? That's the difference between the two of them. I know it's uncomfortable to talk about, even contemplate that people might intentionally discriminate. What you end up doing as a business practice will largely be your decision. Whether you help people participate in any type of discrimination will largely be your decision. What's not your decision is which types of discrimination are illegal. There are things that I think should be protected classes. There are things that a lot of other people think should be protected classes. So I forget, I think it was Jessica who brought this topic up earlier, and I think it's a good time to circle back to it. Jessica, in your opinion, should military families be a protected class? Should veterans be a protected class? In other words, should it be illegal to discriminate against veterans in real estate transactions?
I feel like it, but I don't think it is.
It's not. It's not. It's not on the list, is it? Would there be anything illegal about saying I refuse to represent veterans because I'm anti-war? Would there be anything illegal about that?
No.
No. Why would there be? Why would there be? And if you said yes, you haven't paid attention this whole time, because you're sitting there and you're listening, but you're still so hard-headed that you want to do what you want to do and damn the law. That's not the way it works. Is there anything illegal? I'm not asking if it's right or wrong. I'm asking if it's illegal to say I'm not going to represent a veteran. Is it illegal?
No.
No, it's
No,
No.
No.
it is not. Do any of you think it should be?
yes, it should be.
Yes.
Right?
Speaking
And-
as a veteran, yeah.
And,
it
and that
should be, but
means
it's not.
you're probably not going to participate that. Everybody, does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
But I would also caution you though, before you quickly say, "Oh, it should be illegal," you might want to think about that. Are there special programs out there to help veterans find and purchase homes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
If they become a protected class, those programs go away tomorrow because you couldn't do what?
Discriminate.
You couldn't single them out.
Yeah.
Right.
If all of a sudden you put veterans on that list, could you have a business card that says, "We love to help veterans. We offer a discount to veterans"? Could you do that?
No.
No.
So it's
Look.
actually better for them.
That's an opinion statement. I don't know. That might be your opinion. But what I'm saying is you need to recognize that legally it's just not on the list, which means legally it can be discussed, good or bad, right? But if it's on the list, it cannot be discussed either good or bad. That's the difference I want you to see. Okay? Amy, you had your hand up.
Sorry, my button wasn't working. So I just want to clarify this, and you can yell at me for this. I don't really, care. So sexuality is not. You can discriminate, or we can't, but.
So do you mean sexuality in the sense of sexual orientation?
Yes.
That is correct. That is not on the list.
I just wanted to clarify.
That is not on the list. Could someone, if you watch Love It or List, it ain't no big secret, I'm married to a man, Could someone tell me and Drew, "I'm not showing you a house, you're disgusting"?
Yeah, they could.
Yes.
And that's happened to me. That's why I wanted to clarify, just to make sure.
That is legal in the grand United States of America. It's not on the list. And folks, it pains me to point out things like that to people, but at the same time, it is so important to understand that the law is the law. And so we have to be very conscious of where the line is drawn. And here's the one thing I would point out to you, Amy, about that. In some ways, maybe it's okay that it's not on the list, because now we can have brokers that say they specialize in helping people who are in that community. They couldn't do that if it was on the list. So there's always a trade-off there, right? But it's important for us to recognize, check the list, check the list, check the list. Before you just reflexively say, "Oh, you can't do that," check the list. Is that getting home for everybody? Right? Yeah, that's really what I want to resonate with you, because I'm not trying to impose my beliefs on anybody at all. What I'm trying to say is, above everything else, you have to follow the law. What you do past that is your decision. I will tell you, I follow the law, and then I also follow my sense of morality. I have followed the law, and then I have also made decisions about working with people who I didn't want to work with, who weren't asking me to break the law, but I just didn't want to work with them, right? I just didn't want to, okay? This slide is there. It might be in a different order, but absolutely. Now, we need to put a name to these violations. We need to put a name to these violations. If we are violating the Fair Housing Act, we do not want to be found guilty of steering people. Steering remember how every violation has a name? Like if you, for example, when we talked about material facts, if you didn't give the information, what was the name of that violation?
Omitting.
Omitting. If you gave wrong information, what was the name?
Misrepresentation.
Representation. When we talked about keeping up with the money, if you spent the money, what do we call that violation?
Conversion.
Conversion. There you go. Good. Good, Christina. What do we call it if you had too much money in your trust account?
Commingling.
Mingling. These violations have different names to them, right? So all we're doing now is putting a name to a violation. Steering is a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act, but only on the buyer-tenant side of things. If you are steering a buyer toward a property, or steering a buyer away from a property, or steering a tenant toward a property, or steering a tenant away from a property, you are violating the Fair Housing Act. In other words, you're using one of those things that are supposed to be off limits as one of your criteria. And you can't do that. So if I said to a buyer, I know it's important to you to be in a neighborhood where there are other Hispanic families, so there are quite a few Hispanic families in this neighborhood. I thought you might be comfortable here. Would that be a violation of the Fair Housing Act?
Yeah.
Yes. And the name of that violation would be what? Steering. Because if you think about it, what am I doing? I'm pushing them toward that, right? Steering is also saying, I don't think this neighborhood's going to be for you. I know you want to be in a neighborhood where there are other Hispanic families, and I've looked around and I don't see a single one around it. This is white around here, right? That would also be an example of what?
Steering.
Steering. In this case, I'm not steering them toward the neighborhood. I'm what?
Steering them away.
I'm steering them away from the neighborhood. The key here is that I'm doing it based on you being a buyer or a tenant. That's what makes it steering. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Now, one of the questions that does come up often is, well, can I give my client advice? Yes, as long as that advice does not cross into those 7 topics. You can't give your client advice about those 7 topics. So the big difference between steering and advice is stop giving advice when it ventures into those 7 topics.
Right.
Give your clients all of the choices and let them narrow it down. That doesn't mean you're not going to help them. I'll give you an example. One steering, one not steering. Somebody comes to me and they're in a wheelchair and they say to me, well, I need the house to be handicap accessible. And I say, okay, I'll be glad to do that for you. Steering.
Yes.
That's steering. Because I've allowed them to focus, I've allowed them to ask me to focus my efforts based on their what? Their disability.
Disability.
Right?
Singling out. Yeah.
I'm allowing them to for me to single out their disability as a central focus point in their search. Now, can they keep their disability as a focus point of their search as the buyer or the tenant? Can they?
Yes, they can.
Of course they can. I can't. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
You want to know how you deal with that same question or same comment and not steer?
Yes.
You go meet this person, you see they're in a wheelchair, you say, well, here are the available options. And they say, well, I need something that's handicap accessible. You say, you know what? That's not really for me to say because I don't know what your needs are. So why don't you tell me what your idea of a property is, what things you would need in the property, what criteria you need, and I'll make sure we find that in the property.
Mm-hmm.
Is that different?
Yes.
Yes.
Because before, whose definition of handicap accessible were we going to use?
Your own.
Mine. Yeah.
Mine. Because I just said, oh, fine, I'll find you a handicap accessible property. Now, whose definition of handicap accessible are we going to use?
The clients.
The clients, right?
Oh.
So they say to me, well, obviously I need a ramp. Okay. Can we now say we will find you a house with a ramp? What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
don't care what might be obvious to them. I'm
Because
just
here's
saying,
the
"All right,
thing.
that's what you said.
A ramp is just as useful for somebody who has a disability versus somebody who does not have a disability.
What if I want to roll my ass up there? You know.
I'm going to tell you what. My knees, all them years of football, sometimes I like a ramp.
Now, Travis, would you respond in a similar way if somebody said, well, I really want to be near this church?
Well, here's the thing. So steering. I'll give you the steering example. I want to be near St. Catherine's Catholic Church. Okay, I'll be glad to help you. I'll be glad to help you with that. That's steering. That's steering. I want to be near St. Catherine's Catholic Church. Well, I really can't focus on that because of the Fair Housing Act. But if you will tell me what area you want to be in, even if you want to just give me an address, I can center your search on an address. Can we still accommodate them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because now all they need to do is give me the what?
Give you an address.
Give me an address. Give me a neighborhood. I can do that.
It's not depend. Right.
What they want.
Right.
It's what they want now. Let them direct you.
Right.
Okay. Vicky.
So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, as long as they tell me exactly what they need, I can definitely accommodate what they want, correct?
As long as what they need is related to the property, not to the people. Right? They can't say,
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to be next door to the Mexican family. That is not something you can
definitely not,
accommodate in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think that's what you meant anyway. I just wanted to be clear in my
No,
answer.
but I thank you though, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it's so as long as they're not saying too, I want to be near this address because it's my church. You just still have to say, well, I can't base it off of that. Just tell me what address you want to be.
Right. You can say, if you give me the address, I'll be glad to center your search on the address. It really doesn't matter to me what's there. You know, because that's the truth. Do you care what's at that address?
No.
No, you just care.
You want to be near there? I'll get you there.
I don't care. I don't care if that's the stripper club and they want to be able to wander home at 2:00 in the morning. Give me the address and I'm going to find you a house close to the address. Right?
I endorse the reason.
Yeah, I do.
You know, it don't matter. It don't matter. And that's what we have to get away from. We have to get away from the topics because we can certainly accommodate people. We just have to get them to direct us a little better.
We
Now,
have a question in the chat here too, Travis, and answer it whenever you want. Rose said, what about if you want to be in a certain school district?
we're going to talk about school districts when we come back from lunch. But here's the thing, folks. School district on that list of things we can't talk about?
No, it is not.
So then can we answer that question? If they want to be in a certain school district, can we get them a house in that certain school district?
Yeah.
Sure.
They advertise it.
Apply the list.
Talk about the children.
Apply the list. Apply the list. The question was, can I talk about a school district? I look at the list. I don't see anything about school district. Can I talk about school district?
Yes.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We'll go into detail after
We're going to go into more detail about that, but folks, the answer is always going to be the same. Look at the list. Look at the list. Look at the list. And if it's on the list, don't talk about it.
Right.
Church, on the list. Don't talk about it.
Somebody might want to be in a certain school district because they want to work there. That's all I'm going to say.
We don't know why they want to be there. They may want to be in there just because it has the best resale value, right?
Doesn't automatically mean kids.
Right. It doesn't automatically. I mean, just like being born in Ecuador doesn't mean automatically you're a certain race, right? Don't make associations that aren't really there. The other name of a violation of the Fair Housing Act is something called blockbusting. If steering was the name that we put on the violation when you're dealing with a tenant or a buyer, if you steer a tenant, you steer a buyer toward a property based on one of those protected classes. If you steer them away from the property based on one of the protected classes, we call that steering. Who do you think this is going to be that we are influencing with our violation? If that one's for buyers and tenants, this one's going to be for who? Sellers and landlords, right? This is the flip side of the transaction. Blockbusting is participating in a fair housing violation when you're dealing with a seller or a landlord. If you're representing a landlord and they say to you, now, I really don't want you to bring families in here who are not U.S. citizens. If you participate in that, you are participating in what? What is the name of the violation? Blockbusting. It's the same violation as steering. It just identifies which side you were dealing with. Does that make sense? And in some ways, it's like the listing and selling words. Listing means you're on the seller's side of things. Selling means you're on the buyer's side of things, right? Blockbusting means you're on the seller's side of things. Steering means you're on the Buyer. That's the only difference between the two. Same violation, just depends on which direction you in the transaction you are. Okay? And that's going to be where we take a lunch break. So I'm going to pause the video. When we come back, we're going to pick this back up, and we're going to continue to talk about some of these things that are not protected that maybe sometimes people believe are, so we can kind of maybe break some of those misconceptions. But we're also going to talk about, which we haven't focused on yet, some of the exceptions to the Fair Housing Act. As we mentioned before the lunch break, not every sort of thing that we think personally that should be considered discrimination is necessarily going to be considered discrimination. And one of the obvious ones that's not on the list that people often are kind of shocked to find out is not on the list is age. Age is not a protected class, meaning it is not a violation of either of the two major laws to discriminate on the basis of age. Age is not covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and it's also not covered under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So age is just not covered, which means while it might not be nice and it might be, uncivilized, whatever you want to say, to discriminate against someone based on their age, it's not illegal to do so. In a real estate transaction. And I think a lot of people just like, in all honesty, how many of you are kind of surprised to find out that age is not protected under any of these discrimination laws? Yeah,
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I think that is surprising for folks, and so it opens up a lot of, questions. So is it okay to tell people they're too old? It is.
We're not saying
legally,
this is right morally. But.
Right. Morally, ethically is a whole different question, but and that's going to vary for everybody. But at the same time, what we're looking at is the legal. Now, one that we have not discussed and we definitely have to discuss is familial status. This is a protected class. This is a protected class, but the name or the phrase familial status doesn't really tell me anything about what's actually the topic I have to stay away from. Anybody want to guess what the topic is that we actually have to stay away from here? One word. Children. Now remember, if we decided that something was a protected class, didn't we say earlier that means we can't use that as a criteria either positively or negatively in a real estate transaction if we're working as a residential broker?
Yes.
Right? Yes. So it's going to be very difficult when you have buyers, maybe even sellers, but particularly buyers, tenants, who are really shaping their search around their children. I've dealt with lots of buyers over the years that the children were, quite honestly, the biggest concern that the buyer had in the whole home search. They wanted a neighborhood that was a good fit for their kids. And I would like to remind you, that is perfectly fine for them. Remember, the Fair Housing Act doesn't apply to buyers. It doesn't apply to tenants. Can they shape their search based on whatever they want to? What do y'all think?
Yes.
Yeah, the buyer, the tenant, they can shape their search based on whatever. It's us who can't be involved in that. So, is it legal for, let's say you've got buyers and they're sitting there in your car and they're discussing between each other if this is a good neighborhood for their children. Is that legal for them to discuss in your car, between the two of them?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely it is. And then they look at you and they say, well, I don't know, we really are looking for a neighborhood that's a little bit better for children. Do you have something you would suggest? What do you have to say? What do we have to say to that question?
Answer that.
I can't answer that. We have to let them know that it's an inappropriate question. And the reason we can't answer it is because children are a protected class. Now, don't take that further than it is. Just like being born in Ecuador does not dictate my race, being protected as a group, when you look at children, does not mean you can't talk about things that are traditionally associated with children. Because the truth is, we don't know why somebody's asking. Questions often come up. Can someone ask me, for example, about school districts? Of course they can, because school districts are not the same thing as what, folks?
Children.
As children. Can people ask me if there's a playground in the neighborhood? What do you think?
Yes, they can.
Yes.
But kids play on that.
So do adults. Weird ones, but so do adults. I have a pit bull who likes to go down the slide in the neighborhood. So sue me. I want to know if I have a playground in the neighborhood. And yes, she does. It is the cutest thing you have ever seen. I have to chunk her fat butt all the way up there to the top so she can ride the slide down. And she loves it. She loves it. Sometimes she even comes down on her back. She will sometimes get on her back and wiggle until she gets over the edge, and then she slides all the way down to the bottom.
Look, I'm not trying to be a troll, but I can just see a dog like with their arms like, no.
She loves it. Her brother, not so much, but she loves it. But you don't know why they're asking if there's a playground. That's for them to know. That gets back to the whole criteria thing. It's sort of like the person who has a disability. If they say, I need a house that's handicap accessible, we can't answer that. But if they say, well, I need a house that has a ramp instead of stairs, we can certainly accommodate that, because that's just kind of a factor, right? And so we have to be really, very conscious of still serving their needs, but while not crossing the line. Now, one of the problems with children being a protected class, and one of the reasons they're a protected class, is traditionally landlords were very restrictive about wanting children. Why do you think landlords in the past were restrictive about wanting children or not wanting children?
Tearing up the property.
Mess up the property.
They mess up the property, right? They break things, they write on the walls, they tear stuff up, right? And so when the law was passed and said, okay, you can't discriminate against children, guess what a lot of landlords turned to as sort of a secondary way to discriminate against families that had children? They put occupancy limits on it. Oh, well, this is a one bedroom, so you can only have 2 people living here. Well, isn't that kind of sort of a way to, limit children when you start limiting occupancy?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
And so we're not saying that occupancy limits are bad. We're just saying be careful when you have somebody who, like a landlord or somebody who says to you, well, I don't want you to go over so many blah, 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 blah. Here's what HUD says. HUD stands for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD says that 2 people per bedroom is a reasonable occupancy limit, which means if you're renting a 4-bedroom house, you can't be more restrictive than allowing how many people there?
8.
8 people. 8 people. Otherwise, you run the risk of them saying you are discriminating on especially if there's some of those people are children. So just be careful with occupancy limits. But, there are lots of examples of discrimination about familial status. Basically, don't make children the focal point of dealing with buyers, tenants, sellers, landlords. As a real estate broker, you really need to keep children off of the discussion list. Now, I recognize that's almost impossible to some extent. I've had people say to me, well, my buyer got in the car and said they saw they were running late because their kids had soccer practice. Is that a fair housing violation? No.
It's not.
First of all, the buyer can say anything they want to say, and it's not a fair housing violation. Second, they're not telling you to buy them a certain house or find them a certain house because their kids had soccer practice. They're just sharing their day, And so it crosses the line when they start to tie in the home search, right? So, and look at Erica. She said, look at that last one there. Wow, look at that. Don't ask them if they have what? Children. And the reason you shouldn't ask them if they have children is because that's not relevant to the service you are providing to them. because the Fair Housing Act says you're not supposed to care if they have children or not.
So what if somebody is like wanting to buy, I don't know, like a shopping center or something, and they say they don't want to be near kids because of vandalization?
Vandalism? Yeah. So what do y'all think about that question? Somebody's looking at buying a shopping center and they tell us as a real estate broker, I'd rather not purchase something near lots of children just because of the potential for them skateboarding around the parking lot and creating, issues and that sort of thing. What do y'all think?
It's not
They can, right?
That's okay.
We can and we can, because again, that's commercial. Love it. Love how you're now applying the rule, right? In commercial real estate, that becomes, as a matter of fact, in commercial real estate, folks, some of this stuff becomes like center point of your discussions. Look, if I'm a real estate broker and somebody comes to me and their whole business model is they want to do like an indoor trampoline place. Guess what? One of our main discussions is probably going to be how many of what there are in the area.
Kids.
How many kids? And that's a perfectly fine conversation in a commercial setting, but not in a residential setting. Does everybody see the difference?
Yes.
And it's because this law only applies to residential real estate. How about this situation? Here's our buyer. We meet him for the first time. What property is you going to show to him?
Whatever he wants.
Everything.
Whatever he wants.
Good job.
Whatever he wants. I'm going to share this with you just very quickly because I think it will resonate it with you a little bit. Every once in a while in this business, you're going to be changed by your clients. And I had the good fortune to be changed in a positive way by a client many years ago, even though it was completely unexpected, and quite honestly, I was about to screw it up. But when I was fairly new in the business, I was meeting with a buyer, out-of-state buyer. I had never met them before. And this was before social media existed. Now everybody Facebook stalks everybody, so you know kind of who you're meeting and you have an idea about them. And, when I first got into business in 2003, you only knew what people told you. And so if you were dealing with an out-of-state buyer, like in my case, I had talked to the couple on the phone and I had emailed with them. Do you think I had any idea about their ethnicity, their age, any of that? No, because I only know the things they tell me, which is perfectly fine. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. In fact, in some ways, it's probably a good thing. I think one of the dangers we have now is we're much more open to the accusation of being discriminatory because we do know so many things about some people, One of the things I try to caution, brokers against all the time, don't go Facebook stalk your clients, because what if you decide you don't want to work with them and they say you didn't work with them because of their ethnicity, because you looked them up on Facebook? I just think sometimes we know too much now. But back then I didn't know anything. And they had scheduled to come to town from New Jersey to look at property, and I had scheduled several houses for them to look at. I met them at the first house. They pulled up, and I was already there. I'm waiting on the front porch. Their van pulls up in the driveway. Keep in mind, I've never met them. They're my clients. They've actually signed a buyer agency agreement. I've never met them. And I go down the front porch steps, and the passenger door opens. Lady gets out. She starts to walk toward me, and the front door of the van is not opening. And the next thing I see is the side door of the van slide open and a hydraulic ramp fold down out of the side of the van. The gentleman who's driving is disabled in a wheelchair, in an electric wheelchair. And he comes out, and I'm talking to his wife, and he comes up, and I shake his hand. I introduce myself. Here's the thing. And I fully admit to this, and to tell you I was wrong, but to show you how you can get better in this business, at least I think you can. The first thing that went through my mind is, crap, I'm going to look like an idiot. Anybody want to guess why it went through my mind? Crap, I'm going to look like an idiot.
Because you didn't look for a house, according to him?
The showings?
Because I had not factored in him being in a wheelchair in what I was going to show them. Here's the truth. should I have factored in him being in a wheelchair and what I was going to show him? No. So in my mind, I'm thinking I've screwed this up, but actually by accident, I've gotten it right. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
But in my mind, I'm so focused on they're going to think I'm an idiot because this house has, the main bedroom upstairs. There's 5 steps you got to go up just get in the front door of this thing. And here he's in a big electric wheelchair. How in the world are we going to get him in the house? That's all that's going through my mind. And I was just about to apologize. I'd introduced myself and I was just about to apologize to him and say, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, you were in a wheelchair. Let's see what we've got that'll work for you. And to this day, I'm doubly thankful for what happened next. Number one, I'm thankful that I did not open my mouth fast enough. And number two, I'm thankful for what he said because it has stuck with me until this day. He said, does this house have a bedroom on the first floor or all the bedrooms upstairs? And my heart sank because I knew my answer in my mind was going to be a disappointment. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
And I said, they're all upstairs. And I was about to say, I'm so sorry. I should have known better. Blah, 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 blah. And I never got a chance to because he looked at me and he said, thank you. And I was so taken back. I had no idea why. It was almost like, what? And he said, thank you. And I said, okay, is that something you wanted? He said, well, no, actually not. And for pretty obvious reasons, that's probably not going to work for us. He said, but thank you for letting me be the one to tell you that. He said, the truth is, we probably wouldn't buy a house with all the bedrooms upstairs. But if it was perfect in every other way, we might figure out a way to make it work. We've discussed potentially putting an elevator in there. We've discussed those things. The big thing is, I just don't like being told what I should look at, and it gets really frustrating. So thank you. Folks, it changed me. It changed how I look at my role in this business. Because what I realized is, this is not about me. It's about them. It's about what they need, and it's about listening to their needs and not prejudging them. And if I could share anything else in this section about it, is do that. Let them tell you what they need, and then you serve their needs. And you can do that without violating these laws. You really can. Vicky, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I actually had a similar situation / story as yours. I'm gonna be honest, my mom walks with a cane. So the house that she's in right now, it is a 2-story. We had it for about a year now. And the realtor was like, he kind of like had the same situation as you. Like when she saw myself and her come in with her on the cane, I saw like his face drop. And my mom was like, he was like, is this okay for you? And she was like, it's actually perfect for me because this helps me with the physical therapy that I need.
There you go.
So then she was like, thank you for going outside of the box and making sure that you didn't just have X amount of homes to show me because I'm on a cane. Because
and the thing of it is, here's the interesting thing. He didn't go outside the box. The whole key is he showed her exactly what he would have shown anybody else, which is the whole point.
Yeah, exactly. And she was like, thank you so much. And it was just like a really sweet situation. I was like, and then that made me think. And then even he said to her, thank you so much for understanding that I'm just doing my job. And it was like a really sweet situation. So I kind of understand where you were coming from with that story.
That's right. I mean, sometimes we're well-intentioned, but the well-intentions lead to us trying to make decisions for these clients, and that's not our role. It's just not our role. So the other thing to understand about handicapping status or disability is some of them are visible and some of them are not. In fact, there are more that are not visible than are visible. So the question often comes up, and I don't want to spend much time on this because it's not the kind of detail you're going to get faced with. The question often comes up, how do we determine if somebody actually has a disability? Like, what do we use to determine if somebody actually has a disability? I'm going to tell you what you use, folks. You take their word for it. If they don't identify as having a disability, they don't have a disability. If they do identify to you that they have a disability, then they have a disability. That's pretty simple, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, you are not a doctor, and even if you are a doctor, you're not serving as one when you're dealing with them in a residential real estate transaction. Your role is to serve their needs, okay? And so you just basically have to take their word for it. That is absolutely the key here. So look at this question. And then I know that Seth has a little video he wants to share with you after we finish with handicapping status. Of the following situations, which is most likely to be considered a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act? A, Sam is a licensed real estate agent who utilizes a credit check to eliminate certain tenants from consideration for rental based on credit history. B, Connie places an advertisement in a local community newspaper that is written in Mandarin Chinese because she suspects Chinese buyers would be interested in her new listing. C, Karen refuses to rent an apartment to an elderly couple based on the fact that they're too old to care for the lawn. Or D, Celia conducts criminal background checks on all tenant applicants for her rental home and refuses rental to those convicted of violent crime. Which one is likely to be considered a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act? Good. Yeah. B. Because you're singling people out. And we should not be singling them out. Example to this that even go further than this. Don't be helpful if you're singling people out. Somebody came to me one time and said, I got buyer clients who speak Spanish and I'm having a really hard time communicating with them. And I said, okay, do you have anybody in your office that speaks Spanish? They said, they do. I do. So that's what I'm thinking, right? I'm just going to give them to the people in my office that speak Spanish. And I said, well, hold on a minute. That's a good thought. But don't do that without talking to who first?
To them.
To the client. It is perfectly reasonable to go to the client and say, is there anything that you feel like we're not getting addressed here? Is there anything we feel like more that we could do? And if they identify and say, well, it would be nice if I had somebody who spoke Spanish, then certainly you can offer that. Does that make sense for everybody? But you don't just go to them and say, oh, by the way, I'm not going to help you anymore, but here Maria is because she speaks Spanish and you'll be a lot better with her. It's not your choice, right? So you be careful with things like that. Be careful with things like that. As far as handicapping status goes, please don't ask them for verification. Take their word for it. That is absolutely the best way to go about the job as a residential real estate broker. Now, if someone is handicapped, we are required to provide one or two types of sort of ways to make their life easier. I don't want to use the same word to define what I'm going to have. We're required to make changes in the way we operate or changes to the property in order to make this a better experience for someone who has a disability. If we are simply changing the way we do business, some policy that we have, that is called making an accommodation. Again, it's an important vocabulary word. Just like blockbusting and steering are both violations of the Fair Housing Act. One is a violation where you're dealing with the buyer. Which one's a violation where you're dealing with the buyer? Blockbusting or steering?
Steering.
Steering. And blockbusting is a fair housing violation if you're dealing with who?
The seller.
Seller. An accommodation is changing a policy, but not changing the property. If somebody wants to rip out the tub and put in a shower because of their disability, that is not an accommodation, folks. Is everybody clear on what I'm saying here? If somebody comes to you and says, I need to install a ramp on the front of the house, that's not an accommodation. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that's the wrong name for it. You have to really know the vocabulary here. You have to be clear on what an accommodation actually is. An accommodation is a request for a change in policy. What kind of policies can you think of, particularly that like a real estate firm or even a landlord might have, that someone with a disability might say, can you make an exception? Because that would really help me if you would make an exception.
Service animals?
How about just animals?
Yeah.
Now, see, Nisha, handlebar in the bathroom, that's not an accommodation. That's changing the property, right? And that's why we got to go through this. An accommodation is changing a policy. Are some landlords going to have no animal policies?
Yeah.
No pet policies? What do you think?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So is it a reasonable accommodation to say, well, I know you don't accept pets, but I have an animal that helps me with my disability. Can you please allow that animal? Do you all think that's a reasonable request for an accommodation?
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
Yes. It doesn't require change to the property, so therefore it's an accommodation. Let me throw this at you. Your buyer says to you, I need to bring my assistance animal with me on the showings when we go look at houses this weekend. Is that a reasonable request for an accommodation, folks? What do you think?
No.
Yes.
Because
Why would it not be?
Because it's your assistant.
Why would an assistance animal? Why would it not be reasonable for them to request their assistance animal, the one that helps them with their disability, to come with them on the showings? Doesn't that sound like a reasonable request to you all?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, now here's the thing. Do you take them into somebody else's house with that assistance animal?
They would
Yes.
ask permission from them first.
Yes, you do. And you don't ask anybody's permission either. I don't care if the seller's allergic to dogs. That's not a dog. That's an assistance animal.
An extension of the person.
I don't care if you're terrified of cats. That's not a cat. That's a what?
Service animal.
That's an assistance animal.
Assistance.
Right?
Sorry.
It's a god.
It's okay.
It can evolve.
Okay. So make sure you understand an accommodation is simply asking for, can you bend your rules a little bit to make my life better? That's what an accommodation is. And a classic example of a reasonable accommodation request is an assistance animal. Now, we've mostly heard service animal. Brady said, can a seller deny access? The seller can do anything they damn well please. I don't care what they do. When I schedule the showing, has the seller said you can bring your client into my house?
He has.
Yeah.
They have. And I'm coming in there, assistance animal and all. And they can get, as my grandfather would say, they can get glad in the same pants they got mad in, because I don't give two shits. I am following a federal law. Simple as that. And here's the thing. Who should have warned them about that when they put their house on the market if they had one?
The agent.
Their agent. Their agent should have made clear that's one of the realities about having real estate brokers bring people into your house. Because real estate brokers don't have a choice. They have to follow what?
The law.
Law.
The Fair Housing Act, right? I have that discussion with every one of my sellers. I say, okay, just FYI, if a buyer has an assistance animal, they're going to be able to come in with that assistance animal. And they say, well, I'll just let you know if that's okay. I'm like, no, you're not going to let me know if that's okay. I'm telling you right now, if you hire me, that's okay. Because there's no other way. As a real estate broker, I'm obligated to follow that law. And so one of the things about hiring me is you're going to have to allow that. Period. End of discussion. It's the way it works. Okay. How are we feeling so far? Okay.
Pretty good.
quick question?
Go ahead, Vicky.
Oh, it's Janet.
Oh, I'm sorry. You didn't light up. Go ahead, Janet.
I just watched a film called Gigi and Ryan, and they monkeys are not allowed in Tennessee, but they were in North Carolina. Are there any animals or breeds that are not allowed legally?
We're going to talk about the difference right now between what is a service animal and an assistance animal. That's exactly what we're about to talk about. A service animal is a dog, period. Dog, 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 dog. That is a very specific animal that is defined by federal law as providing service to those with a disability. Here's why that is an important distinction. Service animals must be allowed in all places, both residential and commercial. Assistance animals are only required in residential spaces because assistance animals fall under what law that only applies to residential spaces?
Fair housing.
The Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act does not make reference to service animals. The Fair Housing Act makes reference to assistance animals. Tracy, I love your question. You're not going to like my answer. What if your client poops or pees in somebody's home?
Same thing.
You clean it up. It's the same thing. You treat someone's assistance animal as an extension of them. That is what you do. That animal is part of them. And again, Erica, allergies too. What if the seller's allergic to my buyer? Oh well, tough shit. You're going to have to deal with it. That assistance animal is an extension of that person. You just have to accept it. That's the law. And notice that service animals are dogs. What are assistance animals under the Fair Housing Act?
Any animal.
Any animal.
Including monkeys.
Assistance peacock. You betcha. Assistance snake. Right? Stephanie, miniature horses used to be allowed as service animals. They are no longer. Just dogs now. Just dogs.
You imagine going to the supermarket with a horse?
Well, here's the thing. Now you can't go to the supermarket with the horse. I mean, you can if that supermarket allows you, but the supermarket's not obligated to allow you because the supermarket is a public place, which only has to allow what kind of animals? Service animals. So your buyer that's looking for residential property has an assistance bird. Do you have to allow the bird to come on the showings?
Yes.
Yes. You take your same buyer to lunch. Does the restaurant have to allow the bird at lunch?
Yes.
No.
No. Because when you go to lunch, you are not in a residential property. You're in a commercial property, and the only animals that have to be allowed there are what?
Service.
Animals, which is a dog. Okay? And so, again, how do we determine if somebody has a disability, folks?
When they
Take their word for it.
Take their word for it. How do we determine if this animal is an assistance animal?
We take their word for it.
Take their word.
We take their word for it. And I know some of you don't like it. I don't like it sometimes. Are there people who take advantage? As sure as the sun comes up tomorrow, there are people who take advantage.
Yeah.
It does not matter. As a residential real estate broker, when somebody tells you they have a disability, okay. When somebody says this is my assistance animal, okay. That's it. That's the end of the discussion.
Right, and I think you can ask for documentation, but you just can't ask them what it's for.
Well, and that's the thing though. You're taking their word for it one way or another. You know, you can't force them to prove it. What are you going to do? Go tie them down at some doctor's office of your choosing and make them go through, like, be poked and prodded and examined until the doctor says, yeah, they need an assistant? That's bullshit. You can't do that, right?
Yeah.
Just get it out of your head. Just get it through your skull. You're going to be taking their word for it, okay? So, and that's the best way to think about it. But also, because you're going to be faced with this in the real world, you're going to be faced with this on a test. An assistance animal is not a pet. right? An assistance animal is not a what?
It's not a pet.
Is not a pet. So anything that uses the word pet does not apply to an assistance animal. Can a landlord have a no pet policy? Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely.
But it doesn't apply to what?
Service animals.
Service animals.
Not service animals, because we're in a residential setting.
I'm sorry.
Assistance animals. That no pet policy does not apply to an assistance animal. Can a landlord charge a pet deposit on a normal basis?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure. Can you charge that pet deposit for an assistance animal?
No.
No.
No, it's not a pet. And I've had people say, like the question came up, well, what if the animal scratches the floor? Well, what if the tenant scratches the floor? Charge them for it. Treat the animal exactly as you treat the human. That's all you got to do, and you'll always be right when it comes to assistance animals. How do we feel about that? Okay? They are an extension of the human. Okay? Natalie said, I'm not sure I understand the difference between the two. Where are you sitting right now, Natalie? Make you answer the question. Where are you sitting right now?
Home.
You're at home in a residential setting.
Yes.
So which one applies in a residential setting? Assistance animals or service animals?
Assistance.
Okay. And an assistance animal can be what species of animal?
Any.
All right. Then what do you not understand? You just answered it perfectly.
The service dog, can a service dog go to an open house?
A service dog can go anywhere.
Anywhere.
Service animals are allowed anywhere.
Public and private.
Assistance animals are only allowed in residential settings.
So assistance animals not allowed in the store. Is that
Unless the store wants to allow them. The store can, of course, choose to allow them, but they're not required to allow them.
You can accommodate.
So the perfect example, two people, they both have animals. One has a service animal, dog. The other has an assistance animal, cat. They live in the same apartment complex. Are both of them going to be allowed to have their animals live with them in the apartment complex?
Yes.
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 That's
The service animal is going to be allowed to live there. The assistance animal is going to be allowed to live there. Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Same two people decide they want to go to lunch together. They show up at the restaurant. Is there any guarantee that both of them are going to be accommodated with their animal at lunch?
No.
No. Which one will be accommodated for sure?
Service.
Service dog.
One with the dog. Which one might or might not be accommodated?
Assistance.
The one with the cat. That's the difference between the two.
So service is both public and private, but assistance is
Anyway.
Just residential. Service is everywhere. Assistance is residential.
So you can maybe remember that by the A in assistance can also mean at home. It
Here's
only
the
matters
simple
at home.
reality. If somebody has a disability and they want to be accommodated everywhere, get what animal?
service.
Service dog.
And what is a service animal? Be specific.
Dog.
Get a dog. See? We told you dogs were better than cats. Y'all didn't want to believe us.
Y'all were jaded.
If you want to be accommodated everywhere, get you a dog. If you want to be told no when you go to the grocery store, get a cat.
I can't believe you are assuming that my cat is a cat.
That's wrong, Travis.
You won't forget it though, right?
Right.
Okay.
Jen, I agree. Service dogs, police dogs.
Yeah. Basically, when they looked at public access, they said, you know what? People in their homes should probably be able to pick and choose whatever animal it is that they need for assistance. But that's a little bit crazy for being in public because you might get exotic species, you might get animals that don't respond well to being in public. So when they wrote the laws for the public sphere, they just said dog. To keep it simple, dog. Okay. Everybody good with that?
Yes.
It doesn't mean a place might not choose to accommodate a rabbit. They can choose. We did that at the school one time. We had a lady show up for class with her service tortoise, a turtle. Her assistant's tortoise. Live with her. Had a leash on.
What?
Yeah. Turtle with a leash.
I heard that. I was cracking up.
Yeah.
On the head, like on the neck?
On his
Or-
neck. Yeah.
What
On his
the
neck.
heck?
Yeah. Like when he went in the shell, the leash would just disappear inside the shell.
In the movie, What About Bob? He had a goldfish.
And she showed up for class with the turtle, right? She showed up for class with the turtle. Were we required to accommodate the turtle in class?
No.
No. Did we? Hell yeah. I thought it was the funniest thing ever. I'm like, this is awesome. Is he going to sit in his own seat? What does he do during class? He just sat over there and munched on lettuce the whole time. That's all he did the whole day, you know. I don't know what service he provided, but he was there, you know. Of course, we Cloroxed the whole place after he left, but, you know, that was after he left. But
It's not a turtle, it's a dog.
you know, that's the difference. Now, an accommodation, remember, is only changing a policy. Is there some other type of change that a person with a disability might ask for that's a little bit more involved?
Modification.
Property modification.
A modification. A modification is asking for permission to actually cut things down, attach things, nail things up, build a ramp, take out a shower, pull the cabinets out of the kitchen so that we can get a wheelchair underneath them. Those are bigger changes to the property. That's called a modification. Here's why that's such a big difference and why we need a different name for an accommodation and a modification. An accommodation is all on the part of the landlord. It's all on the part of the landlord to say, yes, we'll make that happen for you. A modification, if you're actually asking for physical changes to the property, the landlord only has the obligation to allow it. They don't have the obligation to what, very importantly?
Pay for it.
Pay for it.
Pay for it. A tenant can request a modification. The landlord's only obligation is to say, sure, as long as you what?
Pay for it.
Pay for it.
As long as you pay for it, and interestingly enough, pay to put it what? Pay to put it back. The landlord can require the tenant to pay for the modification and pay to put it back. They just can't refuse the modification. They can't say, no, we don't want you doing all that. You can move out if you want to, but we're not going to let you rip out the kitchen cabinets. That's not acceptable. Everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
If that tenant's willing to pay to rip the kitchen cabinets out and willing to pay to put them back, you got to let them do it.
The P for property modification can say pay for.
There you go. Okay. So just make sure you know the difference between a modification and an accommodation. So look at this question right here. This question says, identify the appropriate response to someone with a disability in a residential transaction. A, charging the tenant for damage done by a verified service or assistance animal. B, asking a seller to heavily consider offers from a certain buyer because the widened doorways meet the buyer's disability needs. C, refusing a buyer the ability to bring their assistant's cat on showings with them because the seller does not want animals in the property. Or D, insisting a landlord pay for renovations that make a property more accessible for those with a physical disability. What is the appropriate response for someone who has a disability in a residential transaction?
Well, I took it away too soon.
That's all right. I love that y'all are on the A bus. There's nothing wrong with charging for damage that a assistance animal does. What would be wrong is charging things that are designed to preemptively, account for damage, like pet fees or pet deposits. You can't do that. But, I've dealt with, property managers. They'll come and say, well, this person had an assistance animal and he chewed up the blinds. Well, then charge them for it. I said, well, let me ask you this question. If the tenant chewed up the blinds, would you charge them for it? He said, yeah, and I'd be a little scared of him. I said, then charge for the animal chewing up the blinds. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Okay. Everybody good? Good. Very good. Very good. And, just kind of, again, a reminder, don't participate in steering, don't participate in blockbusting. Those would be violations of the Fair Housing Act. Also, be very conscious of advertising. Don't target your advertising. Remember, don't single out based on those groups. Don't use like descriptions that involve houses of worship. Don't use those things that single people out. So there is one time though, that advertising can be discriminatory. And I really think this is probably going to be a test question. I really do. There's only one time that you can advertise the intent to discriminate. How many of you think they like to test you on the exceptions to stuff?
Yep.
Right? The one time that the intent to discriminate can be advertised is something called the roommate rule. And you've all seen this in action. You just never thought about it as being an exemption to the Fair Housing Act. What's one of the categories that we're not allowed to talk about as a topic under the Fair Housing Act? Isn't gender or sex one of the things we're not allowed to talk about?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
How many of you have ever seen this? Female seeking female roommate.
Oh, yeah, see it all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't that seem like it would be a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? It's allowed because it's an exemption. The Supreme Court of the United States said that people have a right if they're looking for a roommate. Now, not if they're looking for somebody to completely rent out the entirety of the property. There's a difference between renting a house to a family or renting a house to somebody and you're not living there versus looking for somebody to live with you in the same property you also occupy. So this would be like somebody renting out a basement apartment in their own house or renting out a room in their own house. If you are looking for somebody who's going to occupy the same physical structure as you, you can advertise that you're looking for a specific gender. So if you're looking essentially for a roommate for yourself, you can advertise you're looking for a specific gender. It's called the roommate rule.
Does this apply to licensees or no?
This applies to everybody.
Okay.
Applies to everybody, yeah. It's the one time that advertising can cross the, border into gender and not be considered a violation. But, keep in mind, don't say, oh, we're renting out a house in Asheville and we're looking for 2 females to rent the house. That's not the roommate rule. Why is that not the roommate rule?
Because you're not living
Because you're not living
You're
there.
not living there, right? The owner has to be living in the property. You're looking for somebody to live with you, not just to rent your property out. Everybody see the difference?
Mm-hmm.
And is the roommate rule, that's literally a name part of fair housing, or?
It's the name of the court decision that created this exemption to fair housing. Fair housing didn't, let me tell you how this came into being. The Fair Housing Act just says you can't do this. A little old lady in Ohio was fined for violating the Fair Housing Act because she placed an ad in a newspaper saying she was looking for a female roommate. And the local Fair Housing Board in Columbus, Ohio, fined her. She was 87 years old, and the Fair Housing Board fined her $5,000 and said, you're violating the Fair Housing Act, which was true. She was violating the Fair Housing Act.
But
The ACLU stepped in and defended her. And that case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided, you know what? If you're looking for somebody that's going to actually occupy the property with you, then you can be specific and say you want a specific gender. And that's how we ended up with this exception. And so we just call it the roommate rule.
I should have put her name on it.
They should have put her name on it. There you go. They should have put her name on it. Okay. There are other exceptions, and we're almost done with fair housing. There are other exceptions that we need to mention to the Fair Housing Act. Remember, commercial property is already exempt. Also remember, sellers are exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act. And for the most part, buyers and tenants are exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act. Even still, there's some further exceptions that we need to mention. Familial status. Remind me what familial status says you can't discriminate against. Children. So normally, could you say no children allowed in this neighborhood?
No.
No.
Could you have like covenants or rules that say nobody under the age of 18 can spend the night in the neighborhood on a normal basis?
No.
No.
No. That would be a violation, would it not?
Yes.
It would be. So how in the world then do we have neighborhoods that say no kids allowed? Right?
It's an exception?
It's an exemption. Bingo. Bingo. It's an exemption. It's an exception. These communities specifically get an exception to that part of the Fair Housing Act. Now, are these communities completely exempt from the Fair Housing Act? Or are they only exempt from that one group, that one protected class?
From that one group.
From that one group. Now, I've had people say, oh, this is an exemption based on age. Age is not a protected class anyway.
Right.
This is an exemption to the protection for children. This allows these neighborhoods to essentially say who can't be there. Children. And have all kinds of rules about children that normally neighborhoods cannot have. Can a normal neighborhood have a rule that says children cannot use the pool?
No.
No. Can a 55 and up community have a rule that says children can't use the pool?
Yeah, they enforce it.
Can a normal neighborhood have a rule that says if you're under the age of 18, you cannot be an overnight guest in the neighborhood?
Yes.
No.
Can a normal neighborhood have that?
No.
Can a 55 and up community have that as a rule?
Yes.
Absolutely. Folks, if you buy in a 55 and up community, they are allowed as a community to have whatever the rules they want about children. There are some of them that don't allow children as guests, period. You ain't going to grandma's house. You can't go to grandma's house. There's one in Cary that you can go to grandma's house, but they actually have as part of their covenants 24 hours max. No child under the age of 18 can reside in the community for more than 24 consecutive hours. And when they leave the community, they have to stay out for 48 consecutive hours before they can come back in for another 24. And furthermore, while they're there, they can't use any of the amenities in the community. This community has an indoor swimming pool, indoor tennis courts, bocce ball courts, and the poor children are out there because they can't go in. Only old people only in the pool. But they can do that because they are exempt from this part of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Everybody good with that so far? Okay, Myra, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question about this. So let's say that somebody wants to buy the property to get it rented out. So pretty much they just want to be the landlord, and they're not. So can somebody under 55 buy the property to get it rented out?
Can somebody under 55 buy? Well, somebody under 55 can buy the property, period. We never said you had to be over 55. We just call these 55 and up communities. You don't have to be over 55 to own property in a 55 and up neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
You just can't have people under the age of what?
18. Oh,
18.
Okay.
Now, hold that thought though, Myra. There is a limit to how many people under the age of 55. And this is why we call them 55 and up communities. Look at this rule right here. If you are going to keep this exemption from the federal government, at all times, all residents of the neighborhood have to be over the age of 55, or no more than 20% of them can be under the age of 55. So can somebody who's 45 own a house in that neighborhood?
Yes.
They can.
Yes, as long as at least 80% of the other homes are owned by people what?
55 and older.
Who are over 55. Let me tell you why this is in there, folks. Remember, this is a bunch of ugly old men who write these laws. Some of them have trophy spouses. And they're sitting there writing this law thinking, wait a minute now, I ain't even going to be able to move in here with Miss Thing, who's 28, that I just married last week. So I need some wiggle room here. That's why this is why I'm just being honest with you about why it happened. You know?
Way too much.
I mean, that's why it happened. So they can have people under the age of 55, just a very limited number of them.
Travis, what if they have kids?
Then they can't purchase in there because kids can't be in there. Because
I mean, after they purchase,
they have to move out. They have to move out. Yeah. And listen, and this gets really contentious with what if kids come after the fact. There was actually a case, Ohio again. There was actually a case in Ohio 2 years ago, very sad case. The grandparents lived in one of these communities. There was a car accident, killed mom and dad instantly. There were a family of 5. Mom, dad, and 2 sisters were both killed in a car accident. Left one kid, a teenage boy who was, I think, 13 or 14, was the only survivor of the family. And he went to live with grandma and granddad, and immediately they had to move out of their house. The HOA said, you can't be here with him because it's 55 and up community. He's literally not allowed. So there's no exception here to this. You know, that's the downside of one of these communities. Of course, the upside is, you know, people can live in neighborhoods without kids if they want to. Are we all understanding these communities and how they work?
Yes.
Everybody good with that? Okay. So just kind of tying a ribbon around this and talking about who is not subject to the Fair Housing Act. Would a FSBO have to follow the Fair Housing Act?
No.
No, because we said who is exempt?
Sellers, buyers.
Sellers, buyers, tenants, right? So that falls under the category of sellers. But a FSBO that hires a real estate broker no longer exempt because who's going to have to follow the law?
Real estate broker.
The real estate broker is, right? Okay. So FSBO would be exempt, but they can't keep that exemption. One thing I do want to point out, FSBO is exempt from the law, but they still can't do what?
Advertise.
They can't advertise that they're going to discriminate. They can discriminate, but they can't advertise that they're going to discriminate. In other words, can a FSBO refuse to sell to somebody because of their religious beliefs?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Could the same FSBO put a sign in the front yard that says, we will not sell to you if you're Jewish?
No.
No, they can't.
No, that would be advertising their discrimination. Does everybody see the difference? Okay. And you're not allowed to advertise your discrimination except in one case. What's the roommate rule? What's the one time you can advertise your discrimination?
Roommate.
If you're a roommate and you're looking for same sex.
You can look for a specific gender if you're looking for a roommate. You can advertise gender specific if you're looking for a roommate for yourself. That's the only time you can advertise. Landlords are exempt under one circumstance. Again, if they're looking for a roommate for themselves. A landlord who's looking for a roommate not only can advertise about gender, but they're completely exempt from the law. So if you're looking for somebody to live in your basement, can you basically choose exactly who you want to live in the basement?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Because a landlord who's going to live with the tenant is exempt. That's another one of the exemptions. We do say, though, that that's not true if the property has 4 or more than 4 total units in it. At that point, you're an apartment building and you just lose that exemption. Because we've had people who would buy an apartment building that had 10 units in it and say, oh, I'm just looking for roommates for myself. No, you're not. Come on, dog. No, you're not. No, you're not. So maximum of 4 units if you want to take that exemption. And just a reminder about the roommate rule, you can only advertise your discrimination if you're advertising for a certain gender for your roommate. So look at this question right here. Which of the following is going to likely be considered a steering violation? Okay, which of the following is likely going to be considered a steering violation? Okay, we've got a seller is encouraged to sell by a licensed broker because minorities are moving into. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. A seller is encouraged to sell by a licensed broker because minorities are moving into their neighborhood. B, a landlord refuses to rent his basement apartment in his personal home to a tenant of a different religious faith. C, Betty places an ad on Facebook Marketplace offering her spare bedroom for rent to females only. Or D, buyers are shown properties in a particular neighborhood because their real estate agent believes the neighborhood is great for children of the buyers. Which one is the likely steering violation? D, good. Steering is a violation of the Fair Housing Act when you're dealing with who?
Buyers.
Buyers or tenants. Good, good. A would be an example of what?
Blockbusting.
Blockbusting.
This is blockbusting, exactly. Okay. This is no violation at all. A landlord refusing to rent a basement apartment in his own home. You're looking for a what?
Roommate.
Roommate. Okay. C, Betty places an ad on Facebook Marketplace offering her spare bedroom to rent for females only. Again, no violation, right?
Right. Roommate.
Roommate. Okay. D is the one that is steering. Oops. Okay. Good. There are some really good examples in the textbook. This is one of the few times where I think it's a good idea for you to take a look at the textbook for sure. So go page 78, 80 when you have a chance and take a look at those. As far as if you ever have issues and you need to file a complaint related to fair housing, North Carolina uses the Human Relations Commission. That's not going to be tested. So I'm not going to spend much time on it, but just so you know, you can file a fair housing complaints in North Carolina with the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. On the federal level, the Department of Housing and Urban Development handles those complaints, and they have to respond to the complaints within 100 days. Redlining is another violation that deals with discrimination, but redlining is most appropriately applied to lenders. Redlining is discriminatory activity that violates the Fair Housing Act done by lenders, saying basically, well, we'll only give you a loan in this area, but using that as a way to steer people. It's basically steering through lending is redlining. Many of you have probably heard the phrase redlining or the word redlining before, because redlining is notorious for having helped create very segregated neighborhoods, because people of certain racial backgrounds would go to the bank and the bank would say, oh sure, we'll give you a loan, but only if you purchase over here, making financing conditional on purchasing in a certain area. Okay. And I know Seth has a video that mentions redlining that we're going to take a look at for you. Well, Taylor, you had a question?
Yeah. So, do y'all know about the Bank of America thing?